The untold reality facing young women in the Amish community before they wed differs greatly from common assumptions. It has nothing to do with domestic duties like preparing meals, keeping a house tidy, or stepping into the role of a spouse. Instead, the true challenge lies in navigating the profound sense of isolation that comes with suddenly living as an outsider in an unfamiliar dwelling that is abruptly designated as your own household. This was a truth that became clear to me during the hours following my nuptials, a vulnerability for which no one had prepared me. My wedding day itself was filled with grace and beauty, characterized by rooms overflowing with relatives, shared laughter among neighbors, and children sprinting across the grass. Banquets of food lined the tables, and every glance cast my way was accompanied by a warm expression of happiness. The atmosphere mirrored everything a celebration of marriage ought to be, bursting with activity, delight, and unforgettable moments. Throughout the daylight hours, my mind rarely found a quiet moment to contemplate the gravity of the occasion, as I was constantly encircled by loved ones, including my mother, sisters, cousins, and peers. Someone was perpetually conversing, offering assistance, or sharing a joyful look, and I cherished every single second of that collective celebration. As nightfall descended, however, the attendees gradually departed, causing the lively sounds to diminish and the echoes of joy to fade into the distance. One after another, the individuals who had populated my world slipped away, which triggered a sudden and unsettling shift in my perception. For the initial time during that hectic day, the finality of my past existence struck me deeply, recognizing that while it was not destroyed, it had officially reached its conclusion. A distinct period of my youth had drawn to a close, meaning I was no longer merely a daughter residing beneath my father's roof, but rather a married woman. While the community frequently discussed the responsibilities of taking a husband, no one ever touched upon the psychological weight of shedding the identity you had carried since childhood. While my partner and I made our way toward our new residence, I gazed silently through the window of the horse-drawn buggy. The passing pathways, the open acreage, and the celestial sky above all appeared completely recognizable, yet an inexplicable transformation had altered my entire perception of reality. Observing my lack of speech, my spouse noted how quiet I had become, prompting me to offer a faint smile and attribute it to exhaustion. That explanation captured a fraction of my state of mind, but it fell short of the complex emotional reality I was experiencing. In truth, I felt suspended in a liminal space between the history I left behind and the future stretching out before me, completely uncertain of my proper place in the world. When we at last reached the property, my husband began transporting our belongings inside, while I tracked his movements with hesitant steps. The dwelling possessed a comforting warmth and an inviting tranquility, but as I paused at the threshold, an invasive realization gripped my mind that this structure did not represent my true home. A wave of remorse immediately washed over me because I understood that it would eventually become my sanctuary, yet in that specific moment, the connection simply did not exist. The space felt as though it was occupied by an unfamiliar persona, someone I was still trying to discover within myself. My spouse guided me through the layout of the cooking area, the parlor, the sleeping quarters, and the food storage, prompting polite gestures and forced grins from me, even though a heavy burden weighed upon my spirit. He then posed a straightforward inquiry, wondering about my initial impressions of our surroundings. Though my instinct was to offer the idealized, joyful response expected of a bride, the words that escaped my lips caught me off guard when I admitted how unfamiliar everything felt. I momentarily worried that my candor might have caused offense, but my partner merely signaled his agreement, confessing that he had experienced an identical sensation upon his arrival. This revelation startled me, as I had falsely assumed he inhabited the space with absolute ease, as if the structures were an organic extension of his being. He countered this notion with a gentle wave of his head, remarking that no environment transforms into a genuine sanctuary overnight. Those specific words resonated deeply within my consciousness, allowing me to finally ease the tension in my posture as I realized my internal conflict might be entirely natural rather than a personal failing unshared by other newlyweds. Much later, once the entire household had grown silent, I took a seat beside the glass pane, watching the lunar glow illuminate the surrounding farmland. The landscape radiated serenity, yet tears began to obscure my vision, arising not from a sense of remorse over my marriage or a lack of affection for my spouse. Rather, I was simply aching for the environment of my upbringing, longing for the familiar auditory backdrops, the predictable daily schedules, and the constant presence of the people who had populated my daily existence. It was in that quiet moment of mourning that I grasped the hidden truth so rarely communicated to young women in our culture, which is that immense happiness can comfortably coexist alongside deep grief for the past. These contrasting emotions, elation intertwined with sorrow, anticipation mixed with longing, and deep affection alongside a sense of forfeiture, can inhabit the human heart simultaneously, a reality that remained entirely unmentioned by those who came before me. As I wiped the dampness from my cheeks, I questioned whether every young woman in the community secretly confronted this identical realization during her initial night as a wife. Soon after, my partner stepped into the room without noise, observing my weeping state with an expression that would permanently alter my view of marital partnerships. He joined me on the seat, showing neither astonishment nor disapproval, a reaction that paradoxically intensified my sobbing, because I had dedicated the entire day to projecting an image of the ecstatic, appreciative, and resilient bride. Having exhausted my emotional reserves, I accepted the cloth he proffered as he quietly admitted he had anticipated this very reaction from me. His foresight caught me off guard, given that no one else in my circle had hinted at such an emotional response, yet he seemed completely prepared for it. I inquired why a warning had never been issued by anyone in the community, to which he responded with a faint smile, explaining that the passage of time causes most individuals to lose their memory of these struggles. He clarified that people readily recall the festivities, the communal joy, and the union itself, but they tend to let slip the arduous nature of the actual crossover period when one exits a familiar existence to step into an entirely separate reality. We sat in mutual silence for a duration, allowing the room to fill with a comforting stillness before he offered an unexpected piece of family history. He revealed that his own sister had wept for hours following her own nuptials, an image that provoked a sudden chuckle from me through my tears, given that she had always presented herself as an unflappable and courageous individual who never encountered self-doubt. He further noted that his mother had experienced the exact same weeping spell according to family elders, a detail that astounded me since neither she nor any of my female relatives had ever alluded to such vulnerability. For my entire life, I had operated under the assumption that every woman navigated the transition into matrimony flawlessly, but I now realized that they simply chose to keep those private hardships unspoken. This realization provided an immense sense of relief, lifting a heavy burden of isolation from my shoulders. When my husband asked what specific aspect of my former life I yearned for the most, I immediately pointed to my family and the reassuring certainty of understanding my exact place in the world. In my childhood home, every single space, routine, and sound carried a clear meaning that defined my identity, whereas this new environment felt entirely unpredictable and unfamiliar. After listening intently, my spouse offered a perspective that would stay with me forever, asserting that I was under no obligation to establish a sense of belonging on our very first night together. He gently reminded me that waking up the following morning did not require me to instantly feel fully integrated into this new household. Hearing those words instantly alleviated the internal demands I had placed upon myself, as I had mistakenly believed I needed to transition into an accomplished spouse without any delay. Human nature does not transform in the span of a single calendar day, even one marked by sacred vows, and he wisely noted that a true household must be constructed gradually rather than manifested in a solitary evening. This insight filled me with optimism, not because my underlying sorrow had evaporated, but because I finally understood that I was permitted to carry that grief for as long as necessary. However, the subsequent morning arrived with an unexpected emotional downturn, as the remaining adrenaline of the festivities vanished alongside the guests, leaving behind the stark reality of everyday existence in an intensely quiet space. The absence of my mother's spoken words, the familiar rhythm of my father's movements, and the distant giggling of my sisters created a painful void in the house. Attempting to conceal my distress, I maintained an outward appearance of normalcy by completing my household duties, preparing the morning meal, and offering smiles, though my internal world was dominated by an intense longing for my origin family. By midday, my spouse perceived my hidden struggle, directly addressing the reality that I was grieving the absence of my kinfolk. My silent confirmation was accompanied by a fresh wave of tears that brought a sense of self-consciousness, as I believed I should have moved past such displays of vulnerability by then. Sitting down next to me, my husband shared a piece of ancestral history regarding his grandfather, who had relocated a distance of 20 miles upon his marriage, a span that, within the context of our traditional community, felt like moving to an entirely different world. His ancestor had endured months of internal conflict due to the separation from his roots, until his own mother offered the profound insight that marriage signifies the enlargement of one's familial network rather than the destruction of the original bond. This perspective struck a deep chord within me, as I had been erroneously framing my new reality solely around what had been forfeited: my childhood dwelling, my established patterns, and my comfortable surroundings. I began to realize that matrimony could also be viewed through the lens of acquisition, representing the addition of new relations, fresh customs, and unique foundations for the future. While the melancholy did not vanish entirely, its sharp edges began to soften into something far more manageable as we observed the evening sun dip below the horizon. I finally comprehended that the missing piece of advice for young women isn't a warning about the hardships of marriage, but rather an explanation that stepping into the role of a wife forces you to become a novice once more. Navigating a new sense of community, constructing a household, and forging a fresh path requires you to operate as a beginner, a state of being that naturally lacks certainty and requires patient, incremental growth. Yet, even with the profound comfort provided by my partner, an unforeseen trial materialized just a few days later that would cause me to deeply doubt my place in this new life. The crisis arose from an incredibly mundane error, occurring on an evening when my new in-laws were scheduled to visit our home for an evening meal. Driven by an intense desire to demonstrate my competence as a homemaker, I spent the entire day consumed by anxiety, repeatedly verifying the state of the kitchen, preparing dishes hours ahead of schedule, and scrubbing surfaces that were already immaculate. This self-imposed pressure mounted steadily until the moment our visitors crossed the threshold, forcing me to put on a facade of ease and assurance that completely contradicted the turmoil churning inside me. Initially, the gathering proceeded beautifully with pleasant dialogue and shared amusement, until a sudden mishap shattered the peaceful atmosphere when a large serving platter slipped from my grip. The resulting crash reverberated through the dining room as the contents scattered across the floorboards, plunging the entire gathering into an agonizing silence. In that mortifying instant, my chest tightened, and a burning sensation rushed to my face as the irrational conviction surfaced that I was entirely unsuited for this life. I immediately dropped to my knees to gather the scattered remnants, uttering a continuous stream of frantic apologies for my lack of vigilance. Rather than facing condemnation or disapproval, I was met with pure grace when my mother-in-law knelt right beside me on the floor, grabbing a cloth to assist with the cleanup without offering a single word of reproach. Moments later, my husband's father and sister joined the effort, transforming a moment of deep shame into an occasion of collective amusement as the entire family began to chuckle. My mother-in-law offered a reassuring grin, suggesting that her own initial weeks as a bride were filled with far greater catastrophes, prompting a playful exchange with her husband that filled the room with warmth. She shared how she had once filled her entire home with smoke after completely ruining a meal during her second week of marriage, spending an hour weeping over the failure, only to ruin a batch of dough days later and shatter a cherished dish the following week. Beholding this woman who had always appeared to me as the epitome of domestic mastery and confidence, I realized she too had once stood in my exact position as an absolute novice. The concept of being a beginner resurfaced in my thoughts, highlighting the fact that my internal struggle stemmed from a premature desire to possess total expertise and security when I was still in the fragile stage of accumulation where mistakes are inevitable. After our guests departed, I sat in quiet contemplation on the porch as the evening stars emerged over the quiet landscape, eventually joined by my spouse who broke the silence with a light-hearted remark about my survival. I offered a weary chuckle, allowing his reassuring words to wash over me before I finally voiced the question that had consumed my thoughts all week, inquiring as to when this place would truly begin to feel like my genuine home. He paused to reflect before admitting that he could not provide a definitive timeline, though he could share his personal path toward finding comfort. He explained that the transformation occurred only after he abandoned the constant habit of evaluating his own status, ceasing to endlessly verify whether he fit into the environment until he awoke one day to the realization that the sense of belonging had already established itself. This wisdom resonated profoundly within me, forcing me to recognize that my own anxiety stemmed from a relentless search for validation and evidence of my adaptation. True belonging is not achieved through a series of tests or concrete confirmations, but rather through the quiet accumulation of ordinary, unhurried days spent simply existing in a space. As the subsequent weeks unfolded, the intense longing for my past gradually waned, allowing the unfamiliar layout of the house to become second nature, and the quiet moments to feel peaceful, rather than isolating. Bit by bit, I established my own personal anchors within those walls, discovering a preferred seating spot, a specific vista from the kitchen window, and a comforting corner on the porch. Months down the road, I returned to my childhood residence for a visit that was deeply comforting, finding the sights, scents, and voices completely unaltered from my memories. Yet, when the hour arrived to depart, I experienced a surprising readiness to leave, realizing as the horse-drawn carriage pulled away that I had not cast aside my original sanctuary, but had simply expanded my life to encompass a second one. This realization brought forth tears of profound gratitude rather than sorrow, illuminating the central truth that young women in our community are rarely prepared to encounter. Experiencing disorientation, intense longing for the past, or even shedding tears in the wake of a magnificent celebration does not indicate a flaw in your relationship or your character. It merely signifies that your spirit is expanding its capacity to hold two separate worlds simultaneously, the one that shaped your past and the one you are actively constructing for your future. Navigating these monumental shifts in existence can be profoundly challenging, even when the transition represents a beautiful and chosen path forward. For anyone who has ever walked through the complex terrain of a major life transition, or who finds value in these quiet reflections on traditional paths, family dynamics, and the endurance of faith, the journey of learning to belong is a universal human story that connects us all.